Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back again, and this time we're going to be looking at the second section of David Armstrong's text, The Nature of Mind. So just a quick recap. In the first section, he talks about what he thinks is the best way to progress in trying to answer this question of the mind-body debate. To begin with, he says, well, we should listen to science, and science is pointing us in the direction of materialism, not dualism. He then deals with the most obvious rebuttal to that, which is, well, why should we listen to science? What gives science special authority? And he explains that science does have special authority for the reason that it is the only field that comes to intellectual consensus. That is, that people who are well versed in the topics that they're talking about or that they are discussing end up agreeing to the same principles. And he says that this is something that is not present in religion or philosophy or literature or art, or really any of the other means that we've used to try and develop knowledge. Okay, so that's where we're at. So what are we going to be looking at today? So in this second section, we're going to be looking, Armstrong's going to be offering an account of what's called Rileyan behaviorism. So the form of behaviorism developed by Gilbert Ryle, and we're going to be hearing Armstrong advocating for this initially, because Rileyan behaviorism is all based around this idea of, well, we can explain mental processes without the need of this spiritual or non-physical mind that Descartes first introduced. To use Ryle's words, we can remove the ghost in the machine. And Ryle will initially define the mind as behavior. So anger is the behavior that we see. So anger is you yelling at someone or you getting into a fight. But what Armstrong is going to point out is that this isn't really the way that we experience anger. Anger is not just you punching the wall. Anger is something else as well. And so we're then going to hear the Rileyan account of this idea of dispositions to behavior. So Armstrong's going to use the analogy of glass and the brittleness of glass. So he's going to point to the fact that glass has this property, and we'll call that property brittleness. That is not the same as the glass breaking, but it is a property of the glass that makes it much more likely to break. So that's what we're going to be hearing from him. To connect this to the mind, your mind has dispositions to behavior. For example, you can think angrily. This is not the same as you punching the wall, but because you have that disposition, because you think angrily, then the behavior is much more likely. So someone who has angry thoughts is much more likely to perform angry behavior. Makes sense. The issue that we've got is that Armstrong's very clear that Ryle believed that the disposition did not cause the action. So the anger in your mind does not cause your angry behavior. But I'm sure we can all relate to times where nothing bad has necessarily happened to us. We just sort of woke up on the wrong side of the bed, and we've been angry, and then we've sort of picked fights all day. So the issue is our experience of emotions like anger are that, well, actually they can cause behavior. They're not just behavior waiting to happen. They're actually a cause for that behavior. They might not be the only cause, but they are one. So by the end of this, we're going to see that Armstrong is not really satisfied with the Rileyan account of the mind. And that's where we're going to be leaving it for this recording. We'll pick up again where he revises behaviorism so that he thinks it's a better fit for being able to explain mankind in a purely physical way. So, books open, highlighters in hand. We're going from the subheading Defining the Mental. So, having in this way attempted to justify my procedure, I turn back to my subject. The attempt to work out an account of mind, or if you prefer, of mental process, within the framework of the physico-chemical, or as we may call it, the materialist view of man. So remember, this physico-chemical idea, he uses this phrase a lot, physicochemical. What he's talking about are the physical structures of the brain, and then also the interplay of chemicals that flow through our brain that bring about different behaviors or emotions or thoughts. So we have hard evidence of this. This is why he's leaning towards this physicochemical account, because we have scientific evidence for it. So what he's saying here is, let's move on. I've explained why science is good. Let's get started with trying to explain man as a purely physicochemical being. So continuing on. Now, there is one account of mental process that is at once attractive to any philosopher sympathetic to a materialist view of man. This is behaviorism. Formulated originally by a psychologist, J.B. Watson, which, for those of you who have done psych, you would know is the torturer of young children. For those of you who haven't, just a quick history on Watson. Watson was curious to find out whether you could, whether fear was learned or whether it was something we were born with. Like, are we born afraid of things like fire or snakes, or do we learn it? And so what Watson did was he had someone volunteered, although she was an employee of his, so how freely her volunteering was is a bit unclear, but volunteered their very young baby, only a couple of months old, to be part of an experiment. And Watson presented the baby with a neutral stimulus. It was generally white fluffy objects, so this ranged from like rabbits to clown masks to teddy bears, that sort of thing. An assistant of Watson would stand behind the baby, and every time this white fluffy object would be presented to the baby, would hit a metal rod with a hammer behind the baby's head to create quite a startling sound. This would trigger the fear response. It would make the baby jump and cry. So every time the white fluffy object was presented to the baby, it was coupled with this loud sound. Eventually, Watson was able to just present the fluffy object, and the baby would start crying immediately, even though no sound had been made. So as terrible as it sounds, and it truly is, I certainly wouldn't want this happening to either of my girls, but as terrible as this is, it actually helped us understand maybe one of the ways that phobias develop. Why do people develop phobias? Well, it could be that something that's relatively neutral, that doesn't pose any threat, was coupled with something that really, really shocked them. And this was enough for them to learn fear of that object. So it did have scientific merit, and it certainly taught us a lot, but probably not in the most ethical way. But back to philosophy. Thank you, Dr. Watson, for scarring the mind of a young child. But formulated originally by a psychologist, J.B. Watson, it attracted widespread interest and considerable support from scientifically oriented philosophers. Traditional philosophy had tended to think of the mind as a rather mysterious inward arena that lay behind and was responsible for the outward or physical behavior of our bodies. So this is kind of the, what Dennett was talking about, the sort of the little man inside you driving you at any time. We like this idea that our body is essentially like a vehicle that we operate in physical space. But that the real us is something else. It's something that's driving that vehicle at any given time. Descartes thought of this inner arena as a spiritual substance. So this is Cartesian Dualism he's talking about, where the mind and body are two separate substances. And it was this concept of the mind as a spiritual object that Gilbert Ryle attacked, apparently in the interest of behaviorism, in his important book, The Concept of Mind, 1949. He ridiculed the Cartesian view, so remember Cartesian means Descartes, as the dogma of the ghost in the machine. So this is often referred to, not just in the Scarlett Johansson movie that was released last year, Ghost in the Shell, but the ghost in the machine is often something that we hear about a misunderstanding of how technology works. So, if you're listening to this in your in your headphones, the ghost in the machine idea is that, we don't really understand how technology works. So there must be a little person inside your headphones, like reading out what I'm reading out in my voice into your headphones so that you hear it. And it seems like it's a recording, but actually there's this mystical other property, this little person, who is making it run. It's not. It's just electrical impulses into a speaker at a certain rate to produce the sound of my voice. So there is no ghost in the machine, and Ryle wanted to show that we could explain our own existence without this ghost. We don't need a non-physical mind. We don't need a ghost in the human machine. So the mind was not something behind the behavior of the body. It was simply part of that physical behavior. My anger with you is not some modification of a spiritual substance that somehow brings about aggressive behavior. Rather, it is the aggressive behavior itself. So Ryle here is basically boiling down the mind into behavior. There is no anger as an emotion. There is angry action. That's it. This is what Ryle is initially suggesting. It might sound silly to you, and it should, because Armstrong's about to say why it's wrong. But I think the key point that Ryle's trying to make here is that, you know, all of this sort of new agey, hippy-dippy stuff, I'm going to, clean your chakra, kind of mumbo-jumbo, is based on this idea that there's something else to us. Like, oh, what's going wrong in your life? Oh, your chakras aren't lined up. We need to line up your chakras, and then everything else will go right. Okay. Sure. Any scientifically minded person should be hearing that and going, yeah, chakras, that's the problem. And that's basically what Ryle is saying Descartes did. Instead of trying to explain how we exist, he said, oh, there's this mystical substance that exists that drives your body. For Ryle and for Armstrong, no, there isn't. Just like when something goes wrong in my life, it's not because of, because the stars are not aligned correctly in my, fifth dimension or whatever other new age crap you want to talk about. It's because something went wrong in my life. That's the way that it works. So, again, Ryle wants to get rid of the ghost in the machine. It's not because of your chakras. It's just because that's the way that mankind is. It's because of the physical processes of your brain. So, continuing on. My addressing strong words to you, striking you, turning my back on you, and so on. This is the angry behavior. Thought is not an inner process that lies behind and brings about the words I speak and write. It is my speaking and writing. The mind is not an inner arena. It is outward act. So initially what Ryle is suggesting is that we can totally discount the existence of mind. There is no mind. There is just action. And this works really well when you consider everyone else that you ever come into contact with. Okay? We hear people often say things like, well, I'm not a mind reader. You have to tell me what you're thinking. Or, well, how was I supposed to know that you were angry? Those kinds of comments show that we're saying, well, I don't have access to your mind. I can only react to the behavior that you're showing me. And that could be telling me something. That's still behavior. But, I can't guess what you're thinking at any given time. Ryle is taking it a step further and saying, they're not thinking. They are just the behavior. That's it. It works perfectly when you think of everyone else, because the privileged access of the mind means that you don't have any evidence that anyone else is thinking at any given time. For all you know, their minds don't exist. Where it falls down is when you think of yourself. I'm sure that we're all very familiar with the emotion of anger at different points, and we know that anger is not just it's not just me yelling out. Like, I can feel angry as well. Okay, I can be frustrated, and that's like an inner state. So it works perfectly for the third person account when you think of everyone else. Doesn't work very well when you think of it from your point of view. Continuing on. It is clear that such a view of mind fits in very well with a completely materialistic or physicalist view of man. If there is no need to draw a distinction between mental processes and their expressions in physical behavior, but if instead the mental processes are identified with their so-called expressions, then the existence of mind stands in no conflict with the view that man is nothing but a physico-chemical mechanism. So he's basically saying, this would perfectly explain man as a purely physical thing. If the mind doesn't exist at all, and there is no such thing as thought or emotion, there is just behavior, Well, that's purely physical. But, as we're going to see, he's going to say that there's big problems with this. However, the version of behaviorism that I've just sketched is a very crude version, and its crudity lays it open to obvious objections. One obvious difficulty is that it is our common experience that there can be mental processes going on, although there is no behavior occurring that could possibly be treated as expressions of those processes. A man may be angry but give no bodily sign. He may think but say or do nothing at all. So this is sort of the stoic problem, where, I could be really, really angry, but just never show it. I might just shut down and not do anything. I won't say anything. I won't respond in any sort of angry way. I'll just be, essentially. And in this case, well, Rylean behaviorism doesn't fit, because essentially Ryle is saying that anger is the behavior. Now, I feel angry. My experience is being angry, but I'm not showing it. So, according to Ryle, it doesn't exist, but it's very real for me. It's going on inside my mind. Okay, so there's a problem here. We experience emotions and thoughts very differently to the actions that we then perform. In my view, the most plausible attempt to refine behaviorism with a view to meeting this objection was made by introducing the notion of a disposition to behave. So I talked about how important this was in class, but dispositions to behave play a particularly important part in Ryle's account of the mind. Let us consider the general notion of disposition first. Brittleness is a disposition possessed by materials like glass. I'll just pause for a moment and go back for a second. So dispositions to behave, what we're really talking about is it's a quality in something that makes that behavior, or makes a behavior, much more likely. Okay? So, for example, there is a disposition in a knife to make it perform the behavior of cutting well. And we might call that disposition sharpness. Okay? Now, sharpness is not the same as cutting well. To cut well is the action. But what makes a knife cut much more effectively than a spoon? Well, it has this disposition that we can call sharpness. Armstrong's going to use the example of glass and brittleness. So why is it that glass breaks so easily? Because it has a disposition to break easily, and we call this disposition brittleness. Okay? So, continuing on. Brittleness is a disposition possessed by materials like glass. Brittle materials are those that, when subjected to relatively small forces, break or shatter easily. But breaking and shattering easily is not the same as brittleness. Rather, it is the manifestation of brittleness. Brittleness itself is the tendency or the liability of the material to break or shatter easily. A piece of glass may never shatter or break throughout its whole history, but it is still the case that it is brittle. So what he's showing with this sentence particularly is that brittleness and the act of breaking can't possibly be the same thing, because all glass is brittle. Okay, that is a property of glass. Okay, but not all glass breaks. There are some panes of glass that will go through its entire existence and never break. It might, break down and decompose and things like that, but it's never going to break, as in shatter, because something was applied to it, a force was applied to it. So because it has this idea of brittleness, but it hasn't broken, well, to have and to have not are two opposing ideas. Therefore, these two must be separate things. Brittleness must be different from the act of being broken. Okay? But it is still the case that it is brittle. It is liable to shatter or break if dropped quite a small way or hit quite lightly. And this is where he links back to the mind with this part that's underlined. So, now a disposition to behave is simply a tendency or liability of a person to behave in a certain way under certain circumstances. So in the same way that brittleness of glass is the likelihood of it breaking under certain circumstances, which is when pressure is applied to it, we can think of our mind as essentially tendencies or liabilities to behave in a certain way under certain circumstances. So to go back to anger, I am likely to act in an angry way because I have a disposition in my mind which is that of anger. All I need is for the right circumstances to present themselves. So someone cuts me off in traffic and I hurl abuse at them. Okay, well, now the circumstance has occurred. So this is a little bit like a force hitting a pane of glass. Let's say a ball hits a glass window. Now that the circumstance has been met, the disposition to act, or the disposition to behave rather, can now come into action. So when the ball hits the glass, the circumstances have now been met. The brittleness of the glass now results in it being broken. Someone cuts me off in traffic, the circumstances have now been met for me to act in an angry way, and I'm going to yell and scream and swear at them. Okay? But why am I likely to behave that way? Because I have a disposition within me that we call anger. Okay, so the brittleness of glass is a disposition that the glass retains throughout its history, but clearly there also could be dispositions that come and go. The dispositions to behave that are of interest to the behaviorist are, for the most part, of this temporary character. So we know that our emotions aren't like all just sitting there. If you're having a relatively good day, you can brush off things really easily and you'll never even feel angry, let alone act angry. So these dispositions can come and go. You wake up the next day and you just had a bad night's sleep. So you wake up with the disposition of anger already in your mind, and then you're probably going to act in an angry way once something happens to you, once the circumstances are met. Alright, so now how did Ryle and others use the notion of a disposition to behave to meet the obvious objection to behaviorism that there can be mental process going on although the subject is engaged in no relevant behavior? Their strategy was to argue that in such cases, although the subject was not behaving in any relevant way, he or she was disposed to behave in some relevant way. So what Ryle is doing here is he's revising his initial point, which is that thought and feelings is just behavior. The mind is behavior. And he's trying to allow for a version of mind that fits better with our experience. And so he's saying, okay, mind is not just behavior, but it is behavior waiting to happen. Okay, it is the disposition to behave in some relevant way. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. The glass does not shatter, but it is still brittle. The man does not behave, but he does have a disposition to behave. We can say he thinks, although he does not speak or act, because at that time he was disposed to speak or act in a certain way. If he had been asked, perhaps he would have spoken or acted. So essentially, if we think of, this idea of speaking is probably not a bad one. Think of someone just sitting by themselves. Hopefully they're not just sitting there talking. We never look kindly on people who sit by themselves and talk to themselves. Let's assume that they're sitting quietly. Maybe they're reading a book. Now, why aren't they talking? Well, because the correct circumstances hadn't been met. There's no one to talk with. No one had asked them a question. They're reading a book at the moment, so they're not talking. Any of those sorts of explanations are fine. Now, let's imagine that you go up to them and you ask them a question. Oh, excuse me, what time is it? That person, they will now respond. They might tell you the time. Oh, it's midday. Why did they talk then? According to Ryle, it's because they had the disposition to talk. It was kind of locked and loaded in their mind, ready to go. But the circumstances had not been met. In essence, no one had asked them to talk yet. Now that someone has asked them to talk, they will talk. Okay? We can say he is angry, although he does not behave angrily, because he is disposed so to behave. If only one more word had been addressed to him, he would have burst out. And so on. In this way, it was hoped that behaviorism could be squared with the obvious facts. So I love this, if only one more word had been addressed to him. I'm sure we've all had those, if one more bad thing happens to me, I'm burning this place to the ground kind of thoughts. That's what Armstrong is talking about here. Why doesn't someone, yell and scream? Well, maybe the circumstances haven't been met yet. Maybe if one more bad thing happens to them, that's when they'll yell and scream. Okay? It's just that the circumstances haven't been met. It is important to see just how these thinkers conceived of dispositions. I quote from Ryle, "To possess a dispositional property is not to be in a particular state or to undergo a particular change. It is to be bound or liable to be in a particular state or to undergo a particular change when a particular condition is realized." So he's still separating this idea of anger as a state. He still is saying, Ryle is still saying that anger is not something that exists in the mind. It's not a separate thing. It is purely the behavior waiting to occur. Okay, it's the bullet in the chamber. And so it might sit there forever. It might never be shot. But as soon as the circumstances are met, then that bullet is going to be shot. So to explain the breaking of a likely struck glass on a particular occasion by saying it was brittle is, on this view of dispositions, simply to say that the glass broke because it is the sort of thing that regularly breaks when quite lightly struck. The breaking was the normal behavior, or not at least abnormal behavior, of such a thing. The brittleness is not to be conceived of as a cause for the breakage, or even, more vaguely, a factor in bringing about the breaking. Brittleness is just the fact that things of that sort break easily. So this is where Ryle presents something that, again, later on Armstrong is not necessarily going to agree with. Ryle is suggesting that brittleness of glass, or these dispositions to behavior, are not a cause of the breakage. They are just the breakage waiting to happen. Now, I'm sure that we can all appreciate the fact that our thoughts can cause us to behave in a certain way, and our feelings and emotions can cause us to behave in a certain way. That's the experience we have of thoughts and emotions, that they can cause us to behave. And so they are one of the things that contribute to the circumstances. Just like someone cutting me off, well, me being angry is also a cause of my behavior of yelling and screaming. If I was having a fantastic day and someone cut me off, I'd probably just sort of roll my eyes and shake my head and go on with my day. Whereas if I'm having a terrible day and lots of bad things have already happened to me and someone cuts me off, now they're going to know about it. So obviously my thinking is a cause, or at least part of the cause of the behavior that I end up showing. Okay? So that Ryle is saying that it's not a cause. It is just the behavior waiting. Armstrong is going to disagree with this. Okay? But although in this way the behaviorists did something to deal with the objection that mental processes can occur in the absence of behavior, it seems clear now that the shouting and the dust have died, that they did not do enough. So here's his issue. They didn't solve the problem well enough. When I think, but my thoughts do not issue in any action. So in other words, when I think of something, let's say when I think angrily, but I never act in an angry way, it seems as obvious as anything is obvious that there is something actually going on in me that constitutes my thought. So our experience is my angry thinking, that is a thing. This isn't just behavior waiting to happen. That's not the way that I experience anger in my mind. It is very, very different to that. And so this is the problem that the behaviorists were not able to solve. Ryle did a pretty good job trying, but he oversimplified things. It is not simply that I would speak or act if some conditions that are unfulfilled were to be fulfilled. So what he's saying here is our mind is not merely behavior waiting to happen. Something is currently going on in the strongest and most literal sense of going on, and this something is my thought. Rylean behaviorism denies this, and so it is unsatisfactory as a theory of mind. So interestingly here, what Armstrong is pointing to is a similar argument to what Descartes said. The cogito argument of I think, therefore I am. and Descartes' conclusion that he must exist as a thinking thing, well, Armstrong is saying that the reason that Ryle is wrong is because I experience my thinking. I know what it is. I have first-hand account of my thinking. And so it's not just behavior waiting to happen. This is an unsatisfactory account of mind. So finishing off this paragraph, yet I know of no version of behaviorism that is more satisfactory. For the moral of those of us who wish to take a purely physicalist view of man is that we must look for some other account of the nature of man and of mental processes. So we'll leave it there with Armstrong basically saying that behaviorism is, at the moment at least, not a complete account of the mind. He still wants to be able to explain the mind in a purely physicalist way, but Rilean behaviorism isn't getting the job done yet. What we'll see in the next section is Armstrong explaining that, well, we can make revisions, we can change it, we can make it better, and that will give us a complete account of man in a purely physicalist way. So hopefully you enjoyed. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Make sure that you follow me or subscribe. That's what it is on YouTube, isn't it? Make sure that you subscribe so that you can get the updates of when I put a new video up. Enjoy. I'll see you in class.